Welcome to Global Perspectives. What are China's intentions as it rises? For answers, we turn to Dean Cheng, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C.
Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Bercia.
Welcome to the show, Dean.
Thank you very much for having me.
So let's start with our favorite subject, China. We've been watching China grow in terms of power, economic power, political power, military power for many years now, and it always says that its rise is designed to be peaceful. What is your impression of China's intentions as a leading expert on this subject?
Well, I think that China is telling the truth when it says that it intends to take advantage of what they term the period of strategic opportunity, which is basically the current decade, the past decade, and arguably the next decade, for China to grow economically, to move up the science and technology levels so that it becomes a more valuable part of the global supply chain, and to firm up its borders. It's that last part that we start seeing some tension between a peaceful rise and growing tension throughout the region. China is not trying to export an ideology the way the Soviet Union was. It is trying to export goods and services. But the interesting problem is that as China has grown, it is increasingly clear that it also wants to reshape the international system. This really shouldn't surprise us. It has profited under the American-led Western system. But China really has a very different view of the world. It historically has dominated all of Asia. It historically has made its neighbors into tributary states. And I think that it is safe to say that as China continues to grow, it is increasingly having frictions, some of which it is causing, with Japan, with its Southeast Asian neighbors, with India, and now that there is a DPP, Democratic Progressive Party government in Taiwan, a return to tensions across the Taiwan Straits.
What does all of this mean for the United States, especially in terms of the relationships China may have with some of the countries you've mentioned and some you haven't mentioned, such as North Korea?
Well, the real interesting problem here is that while the U.S. and China have very few problems where they go directly head-to-head, China's problems with countries like Japan put it at odds with the United States because we are allied with them. And for example, President Trump, President Obama, President Clinton all have had to reiterate the American commitment to helping defend the Senkakus, which is a group of uninhabited islands that China also lays claim to as the Diaoyutai. And this is an area of direct friction where the U.S. could be drawn into, frankly, an open conflict if China keeps pushing the way it has been over the last several months into that area. The same is true for the South China Sea. The U.S. has no claims to any territory in that part of the world, and the U.S. has made very clear, again through repeated presidents, that we take no position on sovereignty, but China's ever-expanding claims over islands like the Spratlys Group or the Paracels is creating real tension and the prospect for conflict. Now that's apart from the economic issues. And there, too, we are seeing growing tension between a China that seems to be feeling that it is not bound by the rules it's signed to, and things like the World Trade Organization, which the U.S. has backed.
Let's talk about that further, but first you mentioned the South China Sea. And this is an area where a lot of countries have interests, where passage is of critical importance for shipping, et cetera, et cetera. How are nations supposed to respond when China starts making claims or creating the basis for claims?
Well, what we saw with the Philippines, which is a signatory to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, as is China, is arguably the best approach, which is to take China to court. They filed a suit under the Permanent Court of Arbitration, as was demanded under UNCLOS, and the court ruled against the Chinese and fully in favor of the Philippines. The problem is Beijing refused to admit that the PCA had any responsibility whatsoever, openly derided its authority after it issued its findings, and has refused to have anything to do with it. So we see the real limits of a more legal-based negotiation-based approach. So what are the other options? They can basically try and be very firm in their own commitments in terms of their territorial claims. They can cooperate with each other. Part of the problem is that these countries don't cooperate among themselves. And they could, if they wanted to, call upon countries like the United States, Japan, Australia, England, and France to basically help pressure the PRC with regards to China's, frankly, overreaching claims.
Talk to us about, again, back on the economic front. Where do you anticipate the biggest challenges will arise over the next, say, 10 years?
I think as China's economy evolves and matures, part of the issue that the Chinese are going to face is a slowing economy. And unless Xi Jinping, especially after the 19th Party Congress this fall, if he does not push a set of economic reforms that gets the country moving again, you're going to see their economy steadily slow down. That's going to have political repercussions, I believe, in China. Protests, unemployment, all of that sort of thing. But the other piece to this is whether or not Beijing is prepared to step up, to act in terms of a responsible international player on things like intellectual property rights, on things like limiting and reducing subsidies, which would benefit its own economy. If Beijing isn't prepared to do those things, I think what we are looking at is a China that is going to have more and more friction with other countries because of its subsidies, more and more friction because it is engaged in cyber economic espionage. And internally, if it has slowing growth, its maneuver space for making the hard choices for economic reform are going to be steadily shrinking.
What is your best estimate regarding China's growth rate right now? We've seen all kinds of numbers, but I think we can be comfortable in suggesting that it's in the single digits.
Not only in the single digits, but I think that most folks would say at this point that it's probably below the official rate of some 6%. Now, what the actual rate is, it's a good question. Chinese statistics are unfortunately fairly notorious for being unreliable. Where this becomes more and more of an issue is not so much what is the precise rate of growth as the trend, and I think it's safe to say that the trend is that it's slowing. But more importantly is at what point do we cross over into we're not creating enough jobs from the Chinese government's perspective to match all the people who are just graduating from high school and graduating from college. And I think we are heading towards that crossover point, which should be a real source of tension if you're in the Chinese government.
Give us an example of the extent of this potentially. There was a book published many years ago called The Coming Collapse of China, and of course the time frame for that came and went. But it talked about the possibility of an overheating economy, stress on the political system, and then eventually a meltdown. Is that something that's possible, or are you talking about economic and political friction at a much lower level?
What I'm thinking of here is that China could wind up in a situation more like Japan. Japan has not seen change in its GDP levels in over 20 years. I mean, basically, it's a lost generation. When you look at sort of in real terms, the Japanese economy has been static. The problem is that, Japan can afford this. It is a wealthy country. China is a poor country. Even though it's the number 2 GDP in the world, its overall stock of wealth is much lower. And it is a country that is also growing old almost as quickly as the Japanese are. So as it's growing older people are unfortunately not going to be as innovative, not as productive. And so you're talking about a combination of factors of a China whose economy may not be growing very much, and there are more and more demands upon that economy that are basically to help sustain its elderly. And that's going to reshape what you can do with the remaining money available.
So do you anticipate hardship, maybe even severe hardship for some or much of the population, or is a collapse scenario something that is possible?
Well, Winston Churchill once said that there is a great deal of ruin in a nation, and China with 1.3 billion people probably has even more potential before it reaches actual. So no, but what I am seeing is a China that, if it wants to grow wealthy, really needs to put in place reforms within that decade of the next 10 or so years. Because after that, I suspect that you're going to have a combination of an aging population and just so much stasis, so much inertia, that trying to impose reform is going to be harder and harder to do if you haven't started. They've already lost over a decade under Hu Jintao and the first 5 years of Xi Jinping. I think that what we are looking at is a China that basically is unable to lift itself out of what's sometimes termed the middle income trap, and is unable to make that leap to really innovation, frontline, cutting edge technology capabilities, really pace setting, that it will be stuck following other people's leads.
Talk to us about the evolving U.S.-China relationship. Both have political systems that are developing in new directions. In some respects, it seems that China is pulling more power back to the center. In the United States, we have new political leaders as well. What does that suggest for the U.S.-China relationship?
I think that the U.S.-China relationship is about to go into a remarkably rocky phase. President Trump, by his own recognition, is not necessarily well versed in foreign policy. He has been willing to touch certain third rails in U.S.-China relations, in particular the one China issue. While he has walked back some of those comments, from Beijing's perspective, this is highly worrisome because they don't know what else he might say or do. I mean, if he's been willing to touch the third rail, in the first few months of his administration, he's got 3 more years to go. For the Chinese, the interesting other problem is that this fall, they are going to be going into their 19th Party Congress. Xi Jinping is going to wind up with an almost entirely new leadership cohort, which means that in about a year, in February of 2018, you would wind up in a situation where the U.S. might actually have a more mature, more experienced foreign policy team than Xi Jinping does, because he will have put in an entirely new group of people. And that is an interesting potential flip. The other aspect here is that with all of the frictions, whether it is cross straits, whether it is China-Japan, China-South China Sea, there are a lot of areas where U.S.-China relations could go wrong. And if the economic relationship remains rocky, as it appears right now, then there's no sort of foundation of stability that everyone can sort of fall back on. And that is the other worrisome part. In the past, we've always had a good economic relationship so that no matter how much tension there was in the security realm, you could fall back on that. Now everyone's sort of holding their breath.
Let's talk about the North Korean piece. This is of great interest to both countries, and China and North Korea have famously had this so-called lips and teeth relationship going back to the founding leaders of their respective communist systems. How strong is that lips and teeth relationship today? And what does it mean when North Korea engages in behavior that other countries regard as belligerent, such as its ongoing missile tests and nuclear research?
I think it's safe to say that if the China-North Korea relationship is as close as lips and teeth in the 1950s, that today it's more like lips and the cup of really gross water holding your grandmother's dentures on its side table. Not nearly as close. And part of this has had to do with the fact that North Korea has rejected any move towards economic liberalization and reform that China has pursued. Part of this has to do with the fact that China, in turn, has kept North Korea really on life support. People who have looked at the famous nighttime photograph of Northeast Asia, Japan is lit up, South Korea is lit up, even China is lit up. But North Korea is simply a single dot at Pyongyang, so that South Korea almost looks like an island because it's all darkness, ocean on 3 sides and North Korea to the north. What this highlights is that China is not supporting North Korea to the maximum extent possible. It could run more electricity into North Korea, it could supply more oil. What it shows is that China too views North Korea as much as a problem as it does an ally. Now, it's not prepared to walk away from North Korea because North Korea has a very intriguing weapon to use against China. It's not nuclear weapons, it's refugees. The possibility of millions of refugees crossing the Yalu in the event of a North Korean collapse. So with that in mind, North Korea has managed to parlay a very poor hand, a crippled economy, a leadership who is very, very isolated, into a country that can really force even large states like China to not push as hard as they might think they could, because for fear of collapse. And the same is true for South Korea and the United States and Japan. We don't want to see a North Korean collapse because of loose nukes, because of the possibility of war. So we're all sort of dancing in a weird way to Kim Jong-un's tune. Now, where is this likely to wind up? The question is whether or not North Korea's leader recognizes that at the end of the day he is as much lucky as he is skillful, or is he going to overplay his hand? And with the recent missile tests and possible nuclear tests, no one is really confident about where North Korea might wind up.
What could North Korea accomplish if it stays on this path in terms of its missile tests and nuclear research in particular? I mean, could we reach the point where it actually poses an existential danger to the United States?
At the rate things are going, I think many analysts would say that North Korea is likely to develop a true ICBM capability within the next several years, probably before 2020. It has shown other capabilities that suggest actual nuclear weapons, and at the end of the day, it is doing things that other people have done, so it doesn't have to do basic research. So putting a nuclear warhead on top of an ICBM is rocket science, but it's not cutting-edge rocket science. And North Korea has smart people in it. So at some point in the very near future, we should expect to see a North Korea that has ICBMs that can reach the United States. And that will change the dynamic, because if it can do so, it may become more stable, it may become more predictable, or it may decide that I can deter the United States and I can play for all the cards, whether it's threatening Japan or threatening South Korea, because the Americans will be deterred by me having a nuclear weapon.
How capable are we in the United States of preventing a missile strike by North Korea if it in fact develops the capabilities you just described? You know, back under former President Reagan, there was this grand idea for a strategic defense system that would protect us primarily against rockets that might be launched from the former Soviet Union. But now it seems that the threat is more likely from so-called rogue states like North Korea. Can we defend ourselves against such an attack?
Well, to begin with, there is no Astrodome defense. There is no grand set of missile defenses that will shoot down anything and everything that comes in. We have been working on missile defenses for the last several decades. We have gotten better at some of the technologies involved. We are trying to improve them. This seems to be a major focus for the Trump administration. But let's be honest, at this point, nobody has actually tested a missile defense system against an ICBM that was live. The best we've done is tried to shoot down Scud-type missiles, which are much slower, which are tactical and operational level missiles. So at this point, I think it's very hard to predict. It's not something I think anybody would confidently say, absolutely, right now we can do it. Whether or not we can do it by the time Kim Jong-un has an ICBM, that's partly going to depend on how much research money we're willing to spend.
Let me ask you a different question. What do you think North Korea, under its current leadership, is capable of doing? Would it go so far as to launch a nuclear-tipped missile? Does it engage in activities that we would consider inappropriate?
I think it's very hard to predict the North Korean planning, but I think a short list of some of the things they have done in the past should give us very little confidence. They have blown up the entire South Korean cabinet. They did this in Rangoon back in the 1980s. They have blown South Korean airliners out of the sky. They have sent assassination commando teams across the border into South Korea and attacked the Blue House, which is the South Korean equivalent of the White House, and were only stopped a block or two away by luck. They have sunk a South Korean frigate, which most people consider an act of war. They have shelled a South Korean island and killed South Korean civilians. So all of this would seem to suggest that predicting what South Korea would not do is a very, very dangerous game, because at this point they have done things that I don't think most other countries would dare do, especially in their economic situation.
But they seem to be, despite their economic situation, continuing to devote a disproportionate share of resources to the military and to missile tests. In particular, the number of tests they've conducted in recent years is almost mind-boggling. At what point do they run out of resources, given their difficult situation and the fact, as you said, that China is no longer supporting them at the level it once did?
Well, again, North Korea appears to be intent upon finding out just how much ruin there is in Churchill's nation. What is striking here is that North Korea has maintained the commitment to developing missiles and nuclear weapons, even when it was suffering a massive famine. Many folks don't realize that during the 1990s, North Korea lost, at least 500,000, perhaps 1 million people to starvation. And yet the leadership of the time refused to make any economic reforms, make any economic changes, which were partly responsible. Their economy is part of what has caused these massive famines. But they've refused to make those changes. China has said to North Korea, you should engage in economic reform, and it's openly rejected that. So, how long can it continue? The problem here is that it's able to continue for as long as China will give it life support. And if South Korea or other countries, including the U.S., decide that they want to reintroduce the possibility of aid, which is sometimes done for the best of humanitarian reasons and other times for more political gain.
China and also Russia have been critical of North Korea's missile tests, but China in particular then comes forward and says we should resolve this in an amicable way, and we don't need an exaggerated response. What do you think China would do if the United States perceived the threat from North Korea to be so dire that it did act militarily?
Well, that is a very difficult question to answer. I think much of this would depend upon whether the U.S. tried to coordinate with China or not, and also what North Korea might have done to provoke the situation. This isn't 1950. I don't think that the Chinese will automatically come to the aid of North Korea, especially if North Korea is seen as provoking the problem. If it fired a missile into South Korea, if it fired a missile into Japan or Japanese territorial waters, if it sank a U.S. destroyer the way it sank a South Korean destroyer, I think all of those could lead to a situation where China would say, listen, you brought this on yourselves. If the U.S. woke up tomorrow morning, however, and decided to start bombing North Korea, which I doubt very much would happen, that would be a very different situation. So I think all of this would really depend on the specific circumstances.
As we move forward in U.S.-China relations, what do you think would be the most productive steps that would help ensure that we would have a reasonably peaceful relationship, despite some obvious tensions that could occur?
I think some of the most important things that the U.S. needs to do is, one, to formulate a consistent strategy and be persistent in following it through. Too often we wind up almost like dogs and squirrels, where we go chasing off after the idea of the moment, and then 6 months or a year later radically alter our strategies, which really doesn't produce much in the way of productive outcome. One of the interesting things that I think President Trump has done with his raising of the one China issue and taking the Taiwan phone call is that he has, in a sense, put the Chinese in a very reactive mode. They can't be sure quite of what Mr. Trump is going to do next. And where that adds up is, I think he's therefore created some interesting maneuver space. If he were to lay down a strategy, which he obviously doesn't have to tell the Chinese, of what it is that he wants to achieve, what are his priorities, and what is he going to do to follow through. And with his background as a businessman, he does have the ability to sort of offer the olive branch as well as the fist, which is to say, he can also express an interest in establishing deals. Now, where he also has to walk very carefully is that those deals cannot come at the expense of traditional alliances, because that would undermine our own credibility. So I think all of those are aspects that should be part of any strategy for the coming rest of this administration.
Dean, we're out of time, but I want to thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you again for having me.
And thank you. For Global Perspectives, I'm John Bercia, and we'll see you next time.